It was a sunny day when Sarah, a nurse and a single mother, rushed to help a stranger. Could this act of kindness change her life forever? A man, bruised and disoriented, lay by the side of the road after a terrible accident. Despite his tattered appearance, she saw the desperation in his eyes. A man with nowhere else to turn. Without hesitation, she brought him to the hospital, patched up his wounds, and sent him on his way. Months passed, and Sarah struggled, juggling medical bills, an impossible job, and a sick mother. But when the weight of her world began to crash down, a familiar knock came at her door. It was him, the man she had saved. Only this time, he wasn't a stranger. He had come back, but not alone. What he offered her would change everything. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. In a small suburban town in Ohio, nestled between quiet streets and aging homes, lived a woman named Sarah Miller. At 32, Sarah was a nurse at the local hospital, leading a life that was as ordinary as it was full of challenges. She was a single mother, raising her 8-year-old son, Ben, and taking care of her elderly mother, Margaret, who suffered from severe arthritis. Sarah's days were long and her nights were shorter still, but she never complained. There was no time for complaints when her family depended on her. When she had mouths to feed and bills to pay. Each morning, Sarah woke before the sun, her eyes heavy from a night of interrupted sleep. She would quietly slip out of bed, trying not to wake Ben, who always found a way to creep into her bed in the middle of the night. After a quick breakfast, she put on her hospital scrubs, tied her shoes, and left the house before the light of dawn had broken through the horizon. She didn't mind the early hours. It was the only time she had to herself, a few quiet minutes before the world demanded everything from her. Her job as a nurse at the local hospital was demanding, but it was a job she had chosen for herself. There in the sterile halls, she cared for patients, some elderly, some young, some fragile, others strong, but all of them were treated with the same compassion, the same care. Sarah had no illusions about the importance of her work. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't come with fame or fortune, but it mattered. It meant something to the patients who relied on her, and that was enough. The hospital wasn't large by any means. It was a small community hospital where the staff knew each patient by name and where the familiar faces of the regulars became as much a part of the building as the walls themselves. But despite the smallness of it all, Sarah always gave her best. She worked through long hours, staying overtime when there was a need and sacrificing her own well-being to make sure that the people she cared for were looked after. There was no rest for people like Sarah, not when there was so much to do and so few hands to help. At the end of each shift, Sarah would head home exhausted, but with a sense of fulfillment. She would spend a few quiet moments with her son, Ben, before helping him with his homework, making dinner, and tending to her mother. Margaret's health had been deteriorating slowly, and now at 70, she relied heavily on Sarah to do most things. Sarah didn't mind. She was the one who had to carry the weight. After all, Margaret had raised her, and now it was her turn to care for the woman who had loved her unconditionally. But tonight, as Sarah drove home, her mind was clouded with worries. Margaret's condition was worsening, and the mounting medical bills only added to Sarah's already heavy burden. There was never enough money to go around. She had scraped by for years, making ends meet with what little she had, but the pressure was building, and it was becoming harder to keep up. As she drove through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, the rain began to fall. At first, it was a light drizzle, but soon it turned into a torrential downpour. The windshield wipers worked overtime, struggling to keep the glass clear. Sarah drove slowly, her eyes on the road, her thoughts elsewhere. She was tired, bone-weary from another day of work, and all she wanted was to get home, to hold her son, to make sure everything was okay. But then, as she approached an intersection on the outskirts of town, she saw him, a figure stumbling through the rain, a man limping, drenched from head to toe, carrying a large worn backpack that hung heavily from his shoulders. His clothing was ragged, his face hidden beneath the hood of a rain-soaked jacket. At first, Sarah hesitated. It was late and the streets were empty. She was tired. She didn't know who this man was or why he was out there alone in the storm. But then, as the car's headlights illuminated his face for just a brief second, something inside her stirred. She couldn't just drive past him. What secret would this stranger bring into her life? Keep watching on Graceful Valor Stories. Sarah's heart beat a little faster. Without even thinking, she slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. The man didn't react right away. He just kept walking as if he didn't expect anyone to stop. Sarah rolled down the window, her voice barely audible over the sound of the pouring rain. "Hey," she called out, her tone soft but firm. "Are you okay?" The man stopped in his tracks, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. His face was weathered, marked with the kind of exhaustion that only comes from years of hardship. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice, "I'm fine," he said, though it was clear from the way he swayed that he wasn't. "I just need to keep walking." Sarah felt a tug at her heart. She couldn't just leave him here, not in this weather, not in this condition. She pushed the door open and stepped out into the rain. "Come on," she said gently. Let me help you. I'll take you to the hospital, get you checked out. The man hesitated, eyeing her cautiously, but then perhaps seeing something in her eyes, he nodded. Without saying another word, he climbed into the passenger seat, his movements slow and stiff as Sarah drove, the rain pounding against the windows. She glanced at the man. He winced in pain as he adjusted his position, his limp more pronounced now that he was seated. He didn't speak much, and Sarah didn't press him. She simply drove, keeping an eye on him, making sure he was as comfortable as possible. They arrived at the hospital a short while later, and Sarah helped him inside, explaining to the staff that he'd been injured. The man remained silent throughout, his face blank, his eyes distant. It was clear to Sarah that something was deeply wrong, but she didn't ask. It wasn't her place. After making sure he was settled and in the hands of the doctors, Sarah left. She didn't think twice about it. This was just part of her job, helping people even when they were strangers. She didn't expect anything in return. It was just the right thing to do. But as Sarah drove home that night, she couldn't shake the image of the man from her mind. There was something about him that felt familiar, like she had seen him before, but she couldn't place it. She didn't think about it long. There were more pressing matters in her life: her son's homework, her mother's health, the constant pressure of getting by. The man, the stranger she had helped, would fade from her mind in time. After all, there were always new patients to care for, new challenges to face. Sarah had learned long ago not to expect anything from the world. She would give, she would help, and she would move on. But little did she know, the man she had helped on that rainy night would come back into her life in a way that would change everything. Weeks passed since that rainy night when Sarah had helped the injured man. Life, as it often does, moved forward, unpredictable and relentless. For Sarah, however, it felt as though the world had become more difficult with each passing day. Her job at the hospital, the one that once brought her purpose and stability, had become a constant source of anxiety. The hospital was undergoing budget cuts, and with fewer patients being admitted, layoffs were inevitable. Sarah had heard the rumors, but when it came to her, it felt like a cruel joke. The announcement was made on a Thursday afternoon. She was one of the many nurses who would be let go. No exceptions, no second chances. She sat in the break room, stunned. The others around her were packing up their things, some with a mixture of frustration, others with relief. But for Sarah, it was like the ground had been pulled out from under her. The weight of her mother's medical bills, her son's school tuition, and now this, her job, her sense of purpose, all gone in an instant. She had tried to stay calm, even when the HR representative handed her the termination papers. "We'll keep your benefits for a while," the woman had said. But Sarah hardly heard her. Her mind was already spiraling. The truth hit her harder when she stepped out of the hospital. As the heavy door closed behind her, the cool air felt like a slap in the face. How was she going to explain this to her mother, to Ben? Without a job, Sarah would lose everything. Margaret's health was failing, and the upcoming surgery to treat her arthritis had already been delayed due to financial constraints. Sarah had worked so hard to make sure her mother would be comfortable, and now it felt like all her efforts were unraveling before her eyes. The bills continued to mount, and her savings, which were barely enough to get by on a nurse's salary, had long since run out. Every decision she made felt like it was leading her to a precipice, and yet, she was powerless to change anything. That night, after Ben was asleep, and Margaret was settled in her chair with a warm blanket, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the faint light from the overhead lamp casting shadows across her tired face. She stared at the pile of bills, the ones that had become far too familiar. The weight of it all, the struggle to keep the house, to feed her family, to keep things from falling apart, was becoming unbearable. The phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was the hospital's billing department calling to remind her of another overdue payment. Sarah let the phone ring out. She didn't have the strength to deal with it. Just as she set the phone down, there was a soft knock at her door. Sarah froze. It was late, and she hadn't been expecting anyone. She stood hesitant before slowly making her way to the door. When she opened it, her heart skipped a beat. Standing there, drenched in the rain, was Richard Thompson, the man she had helped months ago, the man she had forgotten about. Only now he wasn't the weary homeless man she had met on the side of the road. Instead, he was impeccably dressed in a suit with a calm and commanding presence that immediately made Sarah feel small in comparison. He looked healthier, stronger, his face no longer shadowed by exhaustion, and for a moment, Sarah couldn't believe her eyes. "Mr. Thompson?" she asked, her voice shaky. "What are you doing here?" Richard nodded, his face softening. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady but warm, "I owe you more than you can imagine, more than I can ever express." He paused, glancing down at his shoes for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "I need to talk to you." Sarah stepped aside, allowing him into the small entryway of her home. Her heart was racing, and she found herself instinctively reaching for the table. Steadying herself, the man who had once been a stranger to her now stood in her home, and she didn't know why he had come or what he wanted. "Please," she said, gesturing to the living room. Come in. Richard hesitated for a moment as if unsure of what to say. He followed her into the modest living room where the sound of the rain against the window seemed louder. Now Sarah led him to the couch, offering him a seat, but before she could ask what had brought him here, Richard spoke again. Sarah, I know this may be a shock, but I came because I remember what you did for me that night when I had nowhere else to go. You didn't ask questions, you didn't care who I was, you just helped me, and I owe you. His words were calm, but heavy, filled with sincerity that made Sarah's chest tighten. He paused, his eyes scanning the room briefly before resting on Sarah again. I've made it my mission to give back to people like you, people who quietly change lives without ever asking for anything in return. He leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. I know you're struggling, Sarah, I know what you're going through. Her heart sank. How did he know? She had kept her struggles so carefully hidden, even from those closest to her. How do you know? She whispered. Richard looked down, taking a deep breath. I've been in contact with a few people who are familiar with your situation. It wasn't hard to find out. You see, I wasn't always this way, successful, well off, connected, but what I learned through my journey is that some kindness, even in its smallest form, can change the course of someone's life. Sarah stared at him, unsure of what to say. She had never once expected anything from him. To her, helping him that night was just the right thing to do, and yet, here he was speaking words she could barely comprehend. I've done some research. Sure, Richard continued. I know you've been laid off from your job. I know that your mother's surgery is coming up, and I know the financial strain you're under. He let out a soft sigh. I want to help. I can help. The room fell silent as Sarah absorbed his words. The man who had once been a stranger to her, a man who had been lost and broken, was now offering her the very thing she had desperately needed, a lifeline. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. You don't have to say anything, Richard replied softly, just let me help. The evening air felt heavy with anticipation as Sarah sat quietly on her couch, Richard's words echoing in her mind. How could she accept his offer? A part of her wanted to reject it, to dismiss the stranger-turned-savior, who had stepped into her life when everything seemed to be crumbling, but another part of her, the part that was exhausted from fighting every day, recognized that this might be the chance she had been waiting for something to lift the weight of so many years of struggle. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, and Ben was fast asleep in his room, the soft sound of his breathing providing a small comfort in the otherwise still house. Her mother was in bed as well, resting after a long day of pain and quiet murmurs. Sarah was the glue holding everything together, and yet she felt like she was barely holding on. How did you find me? Sarah asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it felt like a weight lifting off her chest just to ask, I mean, how did you know? Richard shifted in his seat, his hands clasped together as he looked at her. His expression softened, and for a moment, it felt as though he was trying to choose his words carefully. Sarah, he began, his voice steady but filled with an undertone of something deeper. I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always someone people would trust. I had my own battles, my own struggles, but something changed that night. You helped me. That act of kindness, it wasn't just a simple thing, it stuck with me. It stayed in my mind, and I knew I had to do something about it. Sarah sat back, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of everything. He was a man who had been so broken that he had wandered the streets, lost to the world. Now he was sitting in her small home offering to help her in ways she never thought possible. It was surreal, like a twist of fate she hadn't seen coming. Why me? Sarah asked, her eyes searching his. Why would you do this for someone like me? Richard paused, and in that moment, Sarah saw the shadows of the past in his eyes. He looked at her as if he could see right through her, understanding something she hadn't yet come to terms with. Because you were the first person who didn't turn away, he said softly. You saw me, Sarah, when I was just a nobody. You didn't care about where I came from or who I used to be. You simply cared, and that's rare. It's something worth saving, worth fighting for. A lump formed in Sarah's throat, and she couldn't hold back the tears that threatened to spill. She had never thought of herself as someone extraordinary, but Richard's words made her realize how much she had been carrying all this time, the weight of raising a child on her own, caring for her sick mother, all while struggling to make ends meet. But despite all the burdens, she never let it break her spirit. Richard reached into a suit jacket and pulled out a small envelope, placing it gently in front of her. This is for you, he said. It's not charity, it's not a loan, it's a gift. I want to help you, Sarah, because I've been where you are, and I know how hard it is. But you don't have to carry it all on your own anymore. Sarah hesitated before picking up the envelope, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside was a check, an amount far more than she had ever seen in one place, a number that felt like it belonged to someone else. Her eyes widened and she felt the breath catch in her chest. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. I don't understand. Richard leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. Because it's the least I can do. I owe you. You gave me more than just help that night. You gave me a chance, and I know that if I can help you in any way, it's the right thing to do. I'm not asking for anything in return. This is just a way to say thank you. The magnitude of his offer was overwhelming. Sarah's mind raced, trying to process the enormity of it all. She had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, on never asking for help, and here in front of her was a man who had been lost, broken, and forgotten, but now stood offering her more than she could have ever imagined. Tears welled up in her eyes again, but this time they were different. They weren't tears of sadness or frustration, they were tears of relief, of hope. For the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to carry the burden alone anymore. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. She didn't know what else to say. There were no words that felt big enough to express her gratitude, but in that moment, Richard's kind eyes told her everything she needed to know. Richard stood and placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression firm, but filled with quiet understanding. "You've been through a lot, Sarah, but you're not alone anymore. Let me help you, it's the least I can do." He gave her a warm smile, then stood up to leave. "I'll check in on you soon," he added, before turning toward the door. "Take care of yourself and your family, and remember, kindness has a way of coming back when you least expect it." As Richard stepped out into the night, Sarah stood there in the doorway, the check still in her hand, her mind racing. She was overwhelmed, caught between disbelief and an unfamiliar sense of relief. She had never asked for anything, but somehow this stranger had given her the very thing she needed most, a chance to breathe. The rain outside had stopped, and Sarah stood in the stillness of her home, the weight of her struggles beginning to lift. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt something shift deep inside her. She wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, Sarah woke with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in months. As she made breakfast for Ben and helped Margaret with her medications, she couldn't help but reflect on the events of the night before. Richard had come into her life unexpectedly, but he had given her more than just financial help. He had given her hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But what Sarah didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that Richard's return was just the beginning. His offer of help wasn't the end of her story, it was only the beginning of a journey that would change her life forever. What new twist awaits Sarah's future? Keep watching on Graceful Valor Stories. Sarah awoke the next morning with a heaviness in her heart, but also a small glimmer of hope. The check Richard had given her was still tucked in her purse, a silent reminder of the extraordinary kindness that had been extended to her. She didn't know what to do with it or how to feel about it. It was so much money, so much more than she had ever seen, and yet, it was a gift that felt undeserved. But Richard had insisted, and as he had said the night before, she didn't have to carry the burden alone anymore. She couldn't help but think back to the night they had met. The man who had been a stranger to her, a man who seemed to have nothing left, had now come back into her life, offering her everything. His words haunted her as she made breakfast for Ben, her son, who was still half asleep at the kitchen table. "Mom, what's wrong?" Ben asked, his sleepy eyes fixed on her as he fiddled with his spoon. His innocent gaze made her heart ache. He deserved so much more than what life had handed them, and yet, she could never let him see her struggles. "Nothing, sweetie, just thinking about some stuff," Sarah replied with a forced smile, trying to push the weight of her thoughts aside. "Let's focus on getting you ready for school." "Okay," Ben nodded, oblivious to the inner turmoil Sarah was battling. She finished making breakfast in silence, her thoughts drifting back to Richard and his offer. She had never been one to rely on others. Her mother had always told her that she should be independent, that a woman had to stand on her own feet. But now, for the first time, Sarah wasn't sure that standing alone was the answer anymore. The day passed in a blur. Sarah spent the afternoon running errands, helping her mother, and trying to keep her mind busy. But all the while, the check weighed on her. It was almost too much to handle. Every time she looked at it, a knot tightened in her stomach. What would she do with it? How could she use it? Was it right to accept such a gift? That night, after putting Ben to bed and tucking Margaret in, Sarah sat alone at the kitchen table, the check resting in front of her. The house was quiet, save for the sound of the clock ticking in the corner. She picked up the check, running her fingers over the smooth paper. It felt like a lifeline, a promise that things could be better. But she was afraid of what it meant, afraid of being seen as weak, afraid of accepting help that came with no strings attached. She had never been comfortable with charity. Just as she was about to put the check back into her purse, there was a knock at the door. It was late, too late for anyone to be visiting. Her heart skipped a beat as she stood up, the fear of the unknown settling in. Who could it be at this hour? She opened the door cautiously, half expecting to see someone from the hospital, maybe a creditor or an insurance agent, but instead she found herself face to face with Richard. His presence was familiar, but there was a different air about him tonight, more formal, more composed. His eyes were kind, but serious, and Sarah could tell something important was coming. "Richard," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "What's going on? Is everything okay?" He nodded, stepping inside the house with quiet grace. "Sarah, I didn't mean to disturb you so late, but there's something I need to say, something you need to hear." Sarah closed the door behind him, feeling a weight settle in the pit of her stomach. "What's going on?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard glanced around the room, taking in the small, modest home. His gaze fell on the family pictures scattered on the mantel, On the worn-out furniture, for a moment, he seemed lost in thought before he turned back to her, his expression serious but gentle. "I've been talking to a few people, Sarah, people who can help, people who know what you've been through," he said slowly, "and there's something I need you to understand. What you did for me that night, it didn't just save my life, it changed everything for me. I never forgot that." He paused, and for a brief moment Sarah thought she could see the faintest flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "But now I need to do something for you, something that I think will change things for you, for your family." Sarah's heart raced as she tried to follow what he was saying. "Richard, I don't." He raised a hand to stop her, his voice calm but firm. "Let me finish. I know you've been laid off, I know about your mother's surgery and the bills you're facing, and I know that you feel like you're fighting a losing battle, but you're not alone, not anymore." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tightening with emotion. "What are you saying?" Richard took a deep breath as if gathering the courage to say the words. "I've spoken with a few key people, and we've managed to arrange something for you. It's a loan, no interest, no repayment deadline, just something to get you through this." Sarah blinked, stunned. "A loan? But what did that mean? How could they possibly help her in such a way?" She had never imagined something like this, it was almost too much to grasp. "How can you do that for me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you go so far?" Richard stepped closer, his expression softening. "Because you saved me, Sarah, and I want to save you. I want to help you get back on your feet. You've been carrying this weight for so long, and it's time that someone else helps carry it for you. Just let us help." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt her guard start to fall. She had always kept her walls high, afraid to let anyone in, but Richard's words were like a balm to her aching heart. She had spent so much time taking care of everyone else, and now someone was offering to take care of her. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she stepped back, overwhelmed. She had been so afraid of asking for help, of appearing weak, but maybe, just maybe, accepting help wasn't weakness. Maybe it was just another form of strength, a recognition that no one should carry everything alone. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't deserve this." Richard smiled softly. "You do, you absolutely do." The days that followed Richard's visit felt like a blur. Sarah had always been a woman who kept her emotions close, but now she found herself thinking about the future in ways she hadn't in a long time. With Richard's help, the immediate financial burden of her mother's surgery was lifted. The loan he had arranged for her, no strings attached, allowed her to focus on what truly mattered, her family, her son Ben, and getting her mother the care she deserved. But the greatest shift came not from the money or the loan, but from the realization that her life could be different, that it was different. The walls she had built around herself, walls that had kept her isolated in her struggle, began to crumble, and as she stood outside her small house, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she realized something else, that this new chapter of her life wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about living. The surgery was a success, Margaret's health began to improve, and while the road to recovery would be long, Sarah could now breathe a little easier. The hospital, in the wake of the budget cuts, had sent her a severance check, but it wasn't enough to ease the stress of finding new work. Sarah had been applying everywhere, but it was a tough market. Yet, despite the uncertainty, she held on to the hope that things would work out. One evening, after Ben had been tucked into bed and her mother was resting, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with the envelope Richard had handed her weeks ago. The check that had once felt like a lifeline had already done its job, paid for the surgery, cleared the medical bills, but there was still a part of her that couldn't shake the feeling that something more had been given, something deeper. The phone rang and Sarah glanced at it, half expecting another bill collector, but when she saw the name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. It was Richard. "Hello," she answered, her voice tentative but hopeful. "Sarah." Richard's voice came through warm but serious. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." No, Sarah quickly replied, her mind still processing the unexpected call. "What's going on?" "I wanted to check in with you," he said, pausing for a moment. "I've been keeping up with your situation, and I think it's time we take the next step." Sarah blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "Next step? What do you mean?" Richard's voice grew softer, more intentional. "Sarah, I've been in touch with a few people who have an interest in what you've been doing, even before all this. I've heard about the care you gave to your mother, the way you managed everything on your own. There's something special about you." Sarah felt a rush of warmth fill her chest, but also a flicker of unease. "I don't understand," she said slowly. Richard sighed as if he had been waiting for her to ask the question. "There's a hospital network that's been expanding, and they're looking for someone with your experience. You may not be a doctor, but you have something much more valuable. Heart, they've been following your story, and they want to offer you a position. It's more than just a job, it's a place where you can make a difference, just like you did with me." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She felt the room spin, the enormity of Richard's words sinking in. "Are you serious?" I don't know what to say." Richard chuckled softly. "You Don't have to say anything just yet, but I want you to know this: you've earned it, you've worked harder than anyone I know, and while no one can repay everything you've done, this is a small way of giving back. Think of it as a stepping stone, and don't worry about the details, we've already taken care of everything. Sarah's mind raced, it felt unreal, like a dream she had long since given up on. She had spent so many years scraping for what little she could find, never imagining a future where she could be more than just a mother, a caretaker, a struggling nurse, but now here was Richard offering her a future she had never dared to dream of. I don't know if I deserve this, Sarah said quietly, her voice trembling. I don't think I've done anything special, I've just been trying to survive, trying to take care of the people I love. You've done more than survive, Sarah, Richard replied. You've shown what real strength looks like. You fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves, and that's worth everything. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. She had always thought that the world measured people by their achievements, their titles, their status, but now she saw that maybe the true measure of a person wasn't in what they had or hadn't done, but in their ability to care, to give, and to keep going, even when it seemed impossible. I don't know what to say, Sarah whispered again, the words coming more easily now, but no less heartfelt. I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you for this. Richard was silent for a moment, as if letting her words sink in. You already have, Sarah, just by being who you are. The line went quiet for a moment before Richard spoke again, his tone gentle but final. You deserve this, Sarah, you've always deserved better, and I want to be the one to help you get there. The tears that had been threatening to fall for weeks finally spilled over, but this time, Sarah didn't try to hold them back. She allowed herself to feel the release, the acceptance of something she had always resisted. Help. She didn't have to do it alone anymore. That night, as Sarah sat alone in the quiet of her home, holding the phone to her ear, everything began to change. The weight of the past few months, the fear, the doubt, the uncertainty began to lift. Richard had given her more than just a job offer. He had given her a chance to finally believe in herself, to see that her kindness, her strength, and her resilience were more than enough. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. The weight of the check, the burden of her responsibilities had all been lifted. She still had a long road ahead, but for the first time, she didn't feel like she was walking it alone. Ben's laughter echoed through the house as he ran through the living room, his backpack swinging wildly. Sarah couldn't help but smile. He had always been the light in her life, and now she felt like she was ready to give him a future, a real future, one that was filled with promise, not just survival. Margaret, too, was doing better. The surgery had been successful, and while there was still a long recovery ahead, Sarah felt confident in the steps she was taking. She no longer had to fight so hard to keep things together. She could finally rest, at least for a little while. And as Sarah sat at the kitchen table preparing breakfast for her family, she couldn't help but think of Richard, the man who had been a stranger, a man who had once been lost, had now become the catalyst for everything she had dreamed of. But more than that, he had become a reminder that kindness, even in its smallest form, has the power to change lives. It wasn't about the money or the job or the opportunities that lay ahead. It was about the fact that she had been seen for the first time. Someone had seen her for who she truly was, strong, capable, and deserving of something better. And that, Sarah realized, was the greatest gift of all. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.